I just, again, wanted to thank everyone for being here and to apologize that this week we're not in person, still recovering here. But Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll be also back in the synagogue. I also wanted to acknowledge how lucky we are to have here with us Steve Shalowitz, who's been to Iraq, I think less than a month ago. Is that possible? Very, very recently. And so he's really done the groundwork very, very recently. And we're very lucky to have him with us. He can address any questions in terms of practical, what's going on the ground today. He's been there, I think, about a month ago. So we're just lucky to have him here. The topic of Iraq and Syria Jews is a unique one because it's the only Jewish community that predates the Jewish community, so to speak, meaning the existence of the Jewish people emanates from the area of Babylon. By the way, when I say Iraq and Syria, I mean it in a way that's sometimes interchangeable and sometimes not. It's the area called Bavel. But sometimes they're referred to as separate parts, and sometimes it even includes parts of Turkey, for example, where Avram Avinu is on the very southern tip of Turkey, close to Iraq. And so sometimes the modern borders kind of mix those countries up. But we're talking about the areas of Iraq, Syria, and also little parts of Turkey sometimes. So the Jewish people actually come from Iraq before, or Bavel, before we even exist as a people. In the year 1812 BCE, you have Abraham born in Ur Kasdim, which is, again, very, very close to the Iraqi border, but in Turkey today. And Abraham is born in Ur Kasdim. You can go visit the city today. Scholars agree that this is indeed the same city as mentioned in the Bible. It's Ur Kasdim, and that's where Abraham famously is told, he and Sarah are told, Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha, you should go, you should leave your country where you were born, and eventually he goes on to Canaan. Now, many people think of Babylon. The next time we're in Babylon, does anyone want to say, by the way, we're going to take more answers. Does anyone want to say when the next time Jews have contact with Babylon since Avram leaves there? We know he goes to Egypt. Well, do we have an answer? Steve, do you want to say something? Well, the answer...
Yeah, I'm unmuting myself here. Yeah,
okay.
First, can I just ask a question, though? Because you said
Sure.
that Ur was near Turkey. The Ur that I was in, where the great ziggurat of Ur, is in southern Iraq. So are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah, I can get you the name of what it's called today in Turkey. From what I understand, Ur Kasdim is an area that's also close to Aram Naharaim, the city of Nahor. And that area is also, it's from my understanding, it's in the southern tip of Turkey, close to Iraq.
Well, actually, because when I was there, I don't mean to sideline the conversation, but when I was there, Ur is outside of Nasiriyah, which is in southern Iraq, and there's a place there called Abraham's house, where he was born. And that's where the Pope visited, etc. So I'll leave that up to you. But in any event, I guess the next time, in answer to your question, wasn't the next time during the Babylonian exile.
Right. So you would think the Babylonian exile. And by the way, interestingly, the debate of where exactly the city of Ur is in Nachmanides. Nachmanides, in his commentary, says that he investigated several students coming from the area, and he has a debate with other commentaries about where it exactly is. But yeah, you know what? We'll have a follow-up on that, exactly where Ur is. So, but you're right. People do assume that the next encounter Jews have with Babylon is when we're expelled from the first temple. But in fact, there's much closer contact, because there's King David conquers all the way up to Syria, to Damascus. And so there are Jews living in Syria. The great kingdom of David extends into what is today Syria. And there's a famous story in the book of Kings where the Naaman is a Syrian warrior. I'm sorry, he's from Aram. And there's a captive Jewish woman who tells him about the miracles of the prophet Elisha. And so you have already mentions of Jewish life in a way in Syria already back in the time of the Bible, in the time of Elijah, in the time of Elisha. Now, why does this matter? Because I'm going to fast forward a bit. The great synagogue of Aleppo, aka Haleb, was built in the 5th to 9th century, but it's called the synagogue of Yoav. Yoav is the warrior. He's the chief of staff of King David. And so the Syrian Jews had a tradition that their synagogue in Haleb, Aleppo, which is definitely an old synagogue, it definitely goes back 1,500 years, but they believed that that was the location where Yoav came and prayed, and they also believe that it's where Eliyahu Navi was. And so it's just important to note that when we're talking about Syria and Babylon, Jewish life there was really already going on during the First Temple. You have Jewish captives taken into Aram. And you have also Jews, for some period, you have Syria being part of the greater kingdom, the kingdom of King David. It's interesting because the sad side, and I know, Steve, you saw a lot of this, the sad side of it is that this great synagogue of Aleppo was destroyed in 2016 during Syria's civil war. And so the synagogue of Aleppo, which is called the synagogue of Yoav, was destroyed in 2016. Interestingly, in a city called Jubair, which is near, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Jubair, near Damascus, there's a synagogue and a cave called the Synagogue of Eliyahu Hanavi. And that's also a place that the Jewish community in Syria revered and believed that this was the place that Eliyahu Hanavi prayed. And they also believe it's where Eliyahu Navi anointed Elisha. And this too, unfortunately, was something that was damaged in the civil war. Now, comes the year 597 BCE, and it's important to note, the Jews were not expelled from Jerusalem in one shot. You have, first of all, you have the expulsion of the Israelites to Assyria, which is essentially Iraq, but you also have the expulsion of Yehoiachin. Now remember that name. Why? Yehoiachin is the king of Jerusalem, king of Judea, who's expelled before the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. Several decades before the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, there's an exile called Galut HaCharash VeHamasger. You're going to get in your Bible classes here as well. And so you have Galut HaCharash VeHamasger, and the prominent Jews of Judea are expelled to Babylon. They set the foundation to Jewish life in Bavel as a diaspora. Now, Yehoiachin is the king. Now, why is it important? Because Babylonian Jews trace themselves to Yehoiachin. You could not be a president of the Jewish community. We'll see later. It's a title called the Reish Galuta. You could not be the Reish Galuta unless you are a descendant of Yehoiachin. You know how a lot of times we speak about people, whether they have a descendant, where they're descendants of Yehuda, can they attribute themselves to King David? Can they find their lineage to King David? In Babylon, the token is Yehoiachin. Are you a descendant of Yehoiachin or not? Why? Because Yehoiachin is the first exile. Yehoiachin is the exile in 597 BCE, and this is the exile where Jews from Jerusalem come, the Charash and the Masger, meaning all the professionals. Everyone had to come from Yehoiachin. Now, that's another interesting thing, and that is yichus. I hope everyone knows what yichus is. Does everyone know what yichus is? It's a good, it's not a Yiddish word, but it could be. Yichus means your ancestry in a more heavy way, meaning are you related to a certain important person? And we'll see that in Babylon, specifically, your yichus matters a great deal. This is not something just for the important people. This is not, are you related to this, are you related to George Washington or something like that? Every Jewish family had to be able to trace itself. And it was very, very strict in terms of who can marry who. If you can trace yourself to this family, if you have a family that's been clean in the sense that you don't marry outsiders that are not with the same yichus, not the same lineage, then you're considered someone who can be married to the same members of the same. It's not exactly like a caste, but it's basically you have to keep the purity of your lineage. And again, a lot of this has to do with the fact that the most prominent families from Jerusalem are sent into exile before the destruction of the temple. We saw last week when we spoke about Italian Jewry that the Rebbetzin Sarah Casuto from Florence, whose husband was killed in Auschwitz, and she later was killed in 1948 with the Hadassah nurses coming to help people in Jerusalem. They were killed by Palestinian nationalists. She has on her monument where she died, it says she's a descendant of Yehoiachin, and it's easy to understand because this was the bloodline that was most important for Babylonian Jews. Later on, you have the destruction of the actual temple, 586, and this is famously Al Neharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu. Now, I want to talk, we take it for granted that there is such a thing as exile. Does anyone know any other people in the world that have a diaspora? Can anyone give an example? Now, of course, if you live close to Fifth Avenue, you see there's the, different day parades. There's the German Heritage Parade, the Polish Heritage Parade, Puerto Rico, Italian, etc. But usually within a short amount of time, communities assimilate to the place they live. Definitely before our day and age, you moved somewhere, you assimilated. That was the thing to do. So the fact that Jews come to Babylon as an organized exile and remain faithful to who they are is something that we cannot underestimate. And in a sense, it's the reason we exist. We would not exist as a diaspora had Jews not been able to sustain themselves first, so to speak, close to home, close to Israel, in Babylon. And in fact, it wasn't something you can take for granted. There's in the prophets, they came over to the prophet Yechezkel, they said, we want to be like the nations. There's the famous story they tell Jeremiah, if a woman is divorced by her husband, does she have any allegiance to him? Therefore, maybe we should come to Babylon and have nothing to do with the God of Israel. And that's how it used to work with with every other nation except for the Jewish people. But this is when we learn how to exist as a diaspora. And I want to tell you something that's in the book of Jeremiah that's the foundation, the guideline to many of us in our communities. Jeremiah sees the Jews coming to Babylon, and he tells them, Benu batim ushvu. You should build houses, settle down. V'nit'u ganot. It sounds very un-Zionist, right? Because the Jews are just out of Israel, and you would think that they'd be devastated and not want to settle down. But Jeremiah tells them, where you are, you should build a house, you should get married, you should have children, you should procreate. And very famously, V'dirshu et shlom ha'ir asher hegleti etchem shama. You should seek the peace of the city where you have been expelled to. V'hitpalelu ba'da. You should pray for it. And so you have for the first time what's in our DNA as Jews, the commandment to seek the peace of the city you're living in. You know, the fact that Jews, we spoke so much about the Nobel Prizes and what Jews contribute to the societies we live in, this is where it comes from. It comes from Jeremiah telling the people, you've just been expelled by the Babylonians. They destroyed your temple, and yet I want you to make sure that you seek the peace of the city that you're living in. Always try and seek the peace of the society you're living in. So that is one thing that we learn about how Jews moved to Babylon. They exist as a minority. They maintain their faith in a foreign land, which is unparalleled in any other culture. And also, they seek the peace of the city that they are living in. Now, at this time, famously, Jews become prominent in government. Famously, who's the most famous at the time? I feel like we have a lot of people that know the answer, and we're taking more answers from the audience for those who wish. And I know we have a question we're going to get to as well. But who are the most famous court Jews, so to speak, the ones that climb the ranks of government? Well, this is how we end up coming back to Jerusalem. You have Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. The king says, take from the wise children of Judea and bring them to me so that they can work in my court. And so Jews have this incredible ability in Babylon to work in the government, to seek the peace of the city that they live in. And obviously, more famously later, you have Queen Esther. But Jews are settling down in Babylon and everything's good. What starts off as Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu, what starts off as crying on the rivers of Babylon, and Im Eshkachech Yerushalayim continues to a more settled life where Jews kind of feel at home in Babylon. Now I'm going to skip. I know usually people would spend on this many hours, but we're going to skip a bit forward, and we're starting to look at Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. And I want to dispel one of the biggest misconceptions in history. When we speak of Shivat Zion, how many Jews do you think come back to live in Israel? How many Jews do you think return to live in Zion? Anyone want to try and guess how many Jews return with Ezra, Nehemiah to rebuild? I mean, it's like, wow, the exile's over. You can all come in. How many Jews come?
Very few.
Very few. 30,000, about 30,000 Jews come and start rebuilding Jerusalem. I know Ben Gurion was furious at American Jewry because when the state of Israel was established, not as many as he expected came to live in Israel. It wasn't like all American Jews just dropped everything and came to Israel. But if you look at the numbers of Shivat Zion post-1948 are much, much better than the numbers of Shivat Zion in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, the return to Zion teaches you something about the spiritual and social state of Jews in Babylon. Number one, Ezra realizes that people are working on Shabbat. He comes and he says, look, people are doing business on Shabbat. There's merchants, there's people bringing out their stuff to sell, and people are working on Shabbat. This is, in Nehemiah. He sees that people are pressing their wineries, and they're pressing their grapes, and this is a sign of here. One second. This is a sign of the waning religiosity among the exiles of Babylon. Number two is intermarriage. A huge amount of intermarriage. Nehemiah famously deals with the issue of Jewish men who married out, and so you can see that for whatever it means, I mean, for good and for bad, meaning for the fact that you see that the Jews were accepted into Babylonian society, that Jews did intermarry, Jews did assimilate, and that was within a few decades. At the time, Jews begin building the first temple. Obviously, we're not going to go through what's going on in Israel. We're going to focus on Babylon, and the Jews established the city, a city that's described in Josephus. Steve, the first Jewish community. I'm not testing you, but the first Jewish community I'd love to hear, by the way, if you've been there. The first Jewish community in Babylon is an exclusively Jewish community.
You got me. You stumped me, Rabbi.
So there's a place called Neharda. I'm going to say it because I feel like you must have been on its ruins or something. It's near the Euphrates, and it's a city that not only became a huge Jewish center, but for a brief period of time, Jews even had a kind of city-state of self-governance there. So Josephus speaks about the fact that the Jews have this town of their own, the city of the Neharda. It later becomes one of the greatest yeshivas, helping to compose the Talmud, and Jews feel good there. Now, in the meantime, even though we think that Jewish life in Israel is the center of everything, which is true in many ways, nonetheless, there are still Jews in Babylon, and they are financially supporting a lot of the Jewish life in Israel. Fast forward to the year 70, the Great Rebellion. Tragically, the Second Temple is also destroyed, and many Jews move back to Babylon. Now, in what way did Babylon already change our life as Jews for eternity? Well, number one, pretty simple, Aramaic. We speak Aramaic. Anyone ever say Brich Shmei or Yakum Porkan or all these prayers, they're in Aramaic. Aramaic becomes the spoken language of the Jewish people, even during the first temple. When there are Jews in the first temple, you see this, by the way, in early sources of Christianity as well. When the Jews are in the first temple, the spoken language is Aramaic, not necessarily Hebrew. And so that's one way. Another thing that Babylon does to change us as Jews forever are our months. We're now in the month of Tevet, not a Hebrew word. And the Jews who go to Babylon bring back with them the Babylonian names of the calendar months. It used to be that if you're Jewish, the name of the month is the first, the second, and the third, meaning Nisan is the first month, Iyar is the second month, Sivan the third month. And what happens is once Jews go to Babylon, they come back and our calendar is with these Babylonian names. They also bring with them the zodiac, and the Babylonians are very, very influenced by the zodiac, or Kasdim, it's the city of the Chaldeans. There's a huge power that magic has in Babylonian culture, and a large part of it is astrology. We're going to see later how that works with the Zoroastrians. But yeah, we bring that back with us, and the communities are very connected. Anyone ever hear the Mishnah about lighting fires from Jerusalem to Babylon? Anyone ever hear the fact that they would communicate the calendar from Jerusalem using fires that would be lit at the top of mountains? No? If not, I'll share it. So the Mishnah tells us that you would communicate originally the Jewish calendar by lighting fires at mountaintops that were seen all the way from Jerusalem, then the next mountain a few miles over, all the way to Babylon. Meaning the Golah was Babylon. Even though there are Jews living in Egypt, there are Jews living in Rome, there are Jews living in all kinds of places, Babylon is called the Golah. That is the exile, which is not a bad thing. It's like people joke and say in Israel, I don't know if anyone ever heard of this joke, but people say, if you live in New York, you live in Chutz La'aretz. If you live anything outside New York, it's already galut, then it's exile. Why? Because Jews in New York feel sometimes like they're, almost in Israel. And so Babylon is called the Golah. Why? Because everything else is even a lower level than that. And so the communication between Israel and Babylon is very, very close. And the rabbinic knowledge there also grows and grows. Very famous Jewish law we have to this day is influenced by Babylon. And that is, we only start praying for rain 14 days after Sukkot. And the Mishnah says the reason for this is so that people can walk all the way from Jerusalem until the Euphrates. That's what it took them. Stephen, I don't know if that's what it takes. You're in better shape than me, that's for sure. But if you want to walk from Jerusalem to the Euphrates, then it's 14 days. And that's the reason we only start praying for rain 14 days after Sukkot in Israel, after Sukkot is over. So that's the customs that shape life to this day. Later on, Rabbi Akiva, before the Great Rebellion, goes to Babylon. A lot of the the calendar making starts taking place in Babylon rather than in Israel. And famously, you have Hillel HaZaken making the calendar that we have to this day later in Babylon. There's a very famous synagogue mentioned already in the Talmud. It's called the Shaf Veyativ Synagogue. It is the synagogue of those displaced and then settled. When the Jews, the tradition is that when the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, they brought with them dirt and rocks, and they built this synagogue in Nahar Da'a. Iraqi Jews believed in the 1800s that this was referring to the great synagogue of Baghdad, but in fact, it was a synagogue in Nahar Da'a, which is southeast of Baghdad. Now, in the meantime, you have the destruction of the Second Temple, And that means that, followed by the Great Rebellion in 132. And that means that Jewish life in Jerusalem is pretty much over, and that most Jews are living in northern Israel, Tiberia, Tzipori, and so that is even closer to Babylon, and the relationship between the two communities gets closer and closer because of that proximity. The Sanhedrin eventually, even the Sanhedrin itself, moves to Babylon. And as Christianity rises, you have the Byzantine Empire, which is pretty oppressive of Jews. Babylon becomes like a bubble, a safe space for Jews. And the Sasani Empire allows for Jews to live in relative peace in Babylon in a way that we were not able to live in other parts of the Byzantine Empire. At the same time, you have the dominant religion. By the way, it's a religion to this day, the Zoroastrians. Zoroastrians is a culture that believes in a dichotomy of black and white, good and evil, dark and light. And it has an influence in terms of it sometimes not letting Jews, the Gemara mentions, sometimes they wouldn't let Jews light fire on certain days. In fact, the blessing we start our day with in the blessings of Shema is Yotzer Or Uvorech Choshech. God creates light and darkness, and that is because the Zoroastrians believe that those are separate gods and conflicting forces. So the rabbis made this blessing where God is the one who makes light and darkness at the same time, and that was sort of a counter to the Zoroastrian system of belief. Years go on, and Jewish life in Babylon really thrives, and the Jews get autonomy. Jews get sort of a space of their own. They're able to operate on their own, and that gives great power to what's called the Reish Galuta. This is a system that existed for a bit later, as we spoke about Poland in the Vad Arba Aratzot, but in general, it's an incredible system that we didn't enjoy in any other place. The Reish Galuta is a government-endorsed position where one person, one Jew, who has to be from the royal blood of Yehoiachin, is in charge of the entire Jewish community. This person can tax the he must tax the Jewish community. Some of the taxes go to the government, and some taxes even go to fund himself, his own institution. The Reish Galuta is in charge of two other very, very important positions, and that is the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, the Nasi, and the great rabbi, the head of the yeshiva, also, it could have been the same person, could have been two different positions, is called the Gaon. Today, if you ask most Israelis, what does the word Gaon mean? Anyone here want to chime in what the word Gaon means? Gaon, usually we call it today a genius, right? The Gaon of Vilna. But actually, the Gaon was a position, Rosh Yeshivat Gaon Yaakov. Gaon means pride in the Bible. And so there were two positions. There was the position of the Rosh Yeshiva, the Reish Galuta, and the Gaon. So it was sort of like a religious institution that was grounded in political power. I would be remiss if I didn't say this joke. There's a joke, we say Yakum Porkan. Yakum Porkan is in Aramaic. There's two prayers. One is for the people in Babylon, and one is for the rabbis in Israel. So there's this joke about, someone gathers for world peace. They decided they're going to gather all the leaders of the great religions, and they're going to ask them to each compromise one part of their religion so there can be just one unified religion. Okay. So they call the Christians, and after long deliberations among the heads of the church, they say, okay, we decided we're going to drop the concept of Trinity. We're willing to make that sacrifice for the sake of world peace. Then they call the Muslim leaders. They say, okay, we're willing to compromise, this part of our religion, that part of our religion, no problem, to reach world peace. They call the rabbis. They speak, they debate, they talk for a long time. And finally, they come out, they say, we agreed that we are willing to skip the second Yakum Porkan, meaning they wouldn't the institutionalizing of different parts of Judaism was something that was very tedious. Even, you had two different Yikum portals, one for the ones in Babylon, one for the ones in Israel, etc. As the Jewish community in Babylon grows, Israel starts dwindling, and basically religion is in Babylon. The greatest contribution of Babylon, in a way, is the Babylonian Talmud. And that is because the rabbis Rav and Shmuel in the third century, they move, they're students of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, they move to Babylon and they start producing texts which make today the Babylonian Talmud. I don't need to tell you about the Babylonian Talmud, about its brilliance, about its historical significance, its codification and canonization of rabbinic law. And that is all something that happens in Babylon. It's important to note the word yeshiva in Babylon meant something a bit different than it does mean today. A yeshiva in Babylon was where all the community leaders, the rabbis, the scholars sat, and that's where laws were made, debated, that's where responsa was written, and they would set the curriculum for all of Babylon. So they would say, okay, in this coming semester, this coming half a year, we're all going to study the following tractate. The time everyone came together to study on during the time of the holidays around Pesach and Sukkot was called Yarchei Kala. So that's the story of Babylon, the story of the Talmud, and basically the Jews living in Babylon are the leaders of religious Judaism in the world, which makes them incredible, an incredible source and a powerhouse in terms of answering the question of others. So this is when you start seeing letters pouring in from as far as Spain to the yeshivot in Babylon. By the way, if you did ask a question to the rabbis in Babylon, usually you included a contribution for the yeshiva. And this is when you have this incredible situation of Babylonian Jewry really running Judaism across the world. Because if you want to know what the law is, what the rabbinic law is, how things should be done, you need to ask Babylon. It used to be Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. Now, if you have a question, you write to the rabbis of Babylon, and you write to these people called the Geonim. The Geonim, again, are the greatest Torah scholars, not necessarily from a Davidic line, but they are appointed by the Reish Galuta. And this is where you have also a lot of power struggles between the institution of the Reish Galuta and the Geonim, but by and large, they work together. In the 700s, there's a fellow named Anan ben David, and I'll give you, I'm biased, first of all. Why am I biased? Because he came at odds with the rabbinic institutions, and the rabbinic tradition is that he got angry because he was not appointed to the position that he got. But basically, this guy, Anan ben David, is appointed to the Reish Galuta, and he's also considered a Gaon. And he does something that is as outrageous as you can imagine. He is the founder of the Karaite movement, as we know it. So Anan ben David, who's the head of the epicenter of rabbinic Judaism, he becomes anti-rabbinic Judaism. He says, I believe only in scripture, and he is the Karaite of the time, like Mikra, and many Jews follow him. And this is a difficult situation because, imagine a situation where, the leader, imagine where the president of Spain decides that he's becoming American. It could be a problem. And so Anan ben David, who's the Reish Galuta, becomes a Karaite, and he's the leader of the Karaite movement. This obviously is not a simple situation. A major event takes place in history, and that is the spread of Islam, and it gets also to Iraq. And you have the two different houses. You have the Umayyads. Steve, help me. Am I pronouncing it correctly? The Umayyads versus the Abbasis? I believe so.
Yes,
right?
I had myself on mute and then I unmute. Yeah, the Umayyads and the Abbasis, yeah.
Okay. So the Umayyads, the Umayyads are in charge in Damascus, and in the year 750, the Abbasis take charge, and they center their seat of government in Baghdad, which is fantastic because it turns Baghdad into a cultural center, a political center, a religious center, which only helps Babylonian Jewry continue to thrive. They do well, and the Jews are living in relative peace with the Muslim rulers. What happens then is you have, again, the thriving of the Geonim, and the Geonim canonize two things that are very famous to us. Number one, the Sidur is established by Rabbi Amram Gaon in the 800s, and the Geonim also create this literature called She'elot HaTshuvot, questions that are sent to them, and they answer these questions. Then famously, you have Rabbi Shrira Gaon, who in the 900s establishes exactly what the rabbinic Talmudic Masorah is, exactly the chain and who the rules of the Talmud. But by now, Babylonian Jewry made its biggest contribution, and that is the Talmud, the canonization of religious rabbinic Judaism. It's important to note that we're already in the years, 700. Not all Jews got the memo. So you have Jews in Iran, in Persia, who didn't know all these laws of the Talmud. You have many places who didn't have all the aspects of the Talmud there, and it becomes an issue in some situations where Jewish communities are like, we didn't get the memo. I want to fast forward to something very, very important called the Keter. The Keter is the ultimate copy of the Bible. In the 900s, the Jewish community in Tiberia establishes the most beautiful, the most precise Bible that's ever existed, and it's not a Megillah, meaning you can flip through the pages. It's more of a book than a Megillah. And this is the most accurate Bible there is. And the Rambam uses it when he makes the laws of exactly how to write a Sefer Torah, etc. And this book is first in Tiberia, then in Cairo. Eventually, it makes it to Aleppo. Now, it's going to drag you a bit through the history. I'm going to jump a few years ahead. And that is because in 1948, spoiler alert, or not spoiler, a bad alert, in 1948, there are riots once Israel is established, and the synagogue of Aleppo is sacked. And this is where you have the oldest, most authoritative copy of the Bible, the Keter. This is something that was with Babylonian Jewry for centuries. It was written in 930. It is what the guide to exactly where you end a parsha, begin a parsha, where you have which dot, it is the most accurate version of the Bible, and it is literally the book we follow. And this important document is sacked in 1948. I got to give a shout out, and a history has to recognize a fellow named Yitzchak Ben Tzvi. He was Israel's president in the 1950s, and he puts out a memo to all Israeli embassies saying, encourage every Jewish community. If anyone finds out the whereabouts of the Keter, which has been around for now more than 1,000 years, let us know so that it ends up in the hands of the Jewish people, but also in the state of Israel. And indeed, in 1953 or so, you have a Jewish family that arrives from Aleppo via Istanbul that brings whatever remainder they have of the Keter in their washing machine, hidden in their washing machine together with food and other things, and they bring it to Jerusalem. They bring it to the president, who puts it into the Israel Museum. It's today in the dome of the Heichal HaSefer, the dome of the book, I think they call it, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And this is something that a contribution that Babylonian Jewry did in terms, and Syrian Jewry, in terms of holding on to something that is the source of how we divided the Tanakh, every dot, every little tiny aspect of the Tanakh. Now, As the years weigh on, the decline of Baghdadi, Iraqi Jewry begins. Rabbi Benjamin of Toledo in the 1200s writes that there are only 40,000 Jews living in Baghdad. One of the reasons is that there's a major famine, a climate change in Iraq that causes major famine, and slowly but surely there's a major decline in Jews in Iraq. Meanwhile, obviously, Jews in Spain, in Ashkenaz, and other places, those communities are growing, and this is when they take over for Bavel's role as the leader of rabbinic Judaism, of the word, of the final decider on what people should do and how Jewish law should be decided. Life continues pretty quietly in Iraq until the 1800s. In the 1800s, when Haskalah, when enlightenment hit the Middle East, Iraqi Jews create an incredible model that is really not done well in many other Jewish communities, synthesizing modernity and tradition in ways that other communities do not. So there's a school built by Kol Yisrael Chaverim, which is the Alliance des Israelites. They established Jewish schools of trade, education, and Iraqi Jews in many ways, with not so much conflict, are able to synthesize the aspects of Judaism, of tradition, keeping Shabbat, etc., but also getting an education and advancing professionally. And that's something that continues with Iraqi Jews. The community becomes very, very, very advanced very, very quickly. It's almost like Jews in Vienna, where like a third of the doctors and lawyers in Vienna were Jewish. And so Iraqi Jews are also excellent in terms of adapting to modernity, culture, music. They really outdo many other communities in their adapting to modernity. All this while being very, very harmonious in many ways. Their chief rabbi, Rabbi Abdallah Somech, is supportive of some of these schools that teach professions. You have obviously the Ben Ish Chai, the chief rabbi of Baghdad, becomes a huge scholar to the Sephardic world. And it's really, the 1800s are in a way another peak for Babylonian Jewry. Damascus Jewry, on the other hand, in the 1840s suffers a blow like no Jewish community has experienced in a long time, the famous Damascus blood libel. It's important for me to note the Damascus blood libel and many of the blood libels in the Middle East at the time were not initiated by and were even against the will of the Muslim community. A Franciscan monk, I believe, and then later the French ambassador, the French consul general in Damascus, push the narrative of Jews, saying that Jews kill innocent people to put blood in matzah, and they pressure the local communities that they live in to prosecute Jews. They arrest a huge amount of the Jewish community, and this is when, shout out by the way to the women in the audience, this is when the Jewish women of Damascus send a letter to the wife of Moses Montefiore, and they say, help us, we are in trouble. And indeed, Moses Montefiore, the international community, gets involved with the horrendous, I'm not going to even give details, torture of Damascus Jews who were tortured one by one to admit false things about ritual murder because of this pressure from the French consulate. I think that even I don't want to misname the newspaper, but even a New York-based newspaper in the 1800s claimed that there's validity to these claims. All right, but Iraq is enjoying a beautiful time. It's the heyday of Iraqi Jews again. And what happens then is very unfortunate. 1929, when you have the pogroms in Israel by Palestinian nationalists, the Tarpat, Tafresh Peitet, the 1929, famously in Hebron in Jerusalem, the massacres against Jews. This is when the flame of anti-Zionism in the form of anti-Semitism is ignited in Iraq, and Jews begin suffering. It gets worse and worse, and Germany of the 1930s decides that Iraq is going to be its base for spreading Nazism in the Middle East because of Iraq's very unstable government. And in 1939, the Grand Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem, because he favors Nazi Germany and World War II breaks out, which means he's at odds with British law, he escapes to Iraq, and he, from there, prints the protocols of the Elders of Zion in Arabic, and incredibly vicious, absolutely, full-blown Nazi propaganda in Arabic. And this is the genesis of Nazi anti-Semitism in the Arab world is the Mufti, the Palestinian Mufti in Iraq, and just in general Germany spreading propaganda there. Jews become increasingly persecuted, which means the Zionist movement moves in, and they try and help in terms of encouraging Aliyah, teaching Hebrew, and creating groups for self-defense. In 1941, an event happens that is important for everyone to know about always, and that is the Farhud. It is the Kristallnacht of Iraqi Jews. In 1941, about 1,000 Iraqi Jews are killed, are pogromed in these anti-Jewish, pro-Nazi events. There's even a moment where Iraq becomes Nazi, overthrows the British. The British overthrows its I guess neutral government, and the British quickly move in to make sure they're in control. But the Farhud is a night where basically Jews were stopped in the street, beaten, Jewish businesses are burnt, and it's basically a Kristallnacht without the aftermath that the Kristallnacht had for Jews in Europe in terms of the Holocaust, but it's a Kristallnacht in the sense that Jews realize this is over. And it's sad because in this decade, Jewish life in Iraq comes to an end after probably 2,500 years or so of continuous Jewish life. This is when it comes to an end with these anti-Zionist pogroms and Jews realizing that it's time to go. The same happens in Syria in a much slower pace, but Iraq is really the epicenter of pro-German alliance during the Holocaust. The Israeli Mossad, Haganah, etc., they start bringing Jews in from Iraq and from Syria as well. They have a few operations, famously, and it's a beautiful name, by the way, as much as it was under bad circumstances, but it's a beautiful name. It's called Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's the operation in which the Israeli government, after 1948, starts flying in Iraqi Jews. The government of Iraq says you can leave. First, they say you're not allowed to leave. Then they say you can leave, but you cannot take a penny. Literally, not a penny. Jews are forced to leave Iraq without absolutely anything to their name. They have to leave their property, their houses, everything is left behind. Some stay, but obviously the conditions are difficult. More Jews actually percentage-wise remain in Syria because the conditions there are not as bad as Iraq, but basically Jewish life in Iraq is not a possibility. Last I saw, I think the last number of Jews there was 2. In about 2010, there were 2 Jews left in Iraq. So it's a tragedy that this chapter of Jewish history, which is the longest one, lasted that long, but ended so abruptly with the spread of, whether it's Nazism or the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian nationalism, and that's how it came to an end. Obviously, Iraqi Jews in Israel reestablished communities. There's synagogues in Jerusalem called Yehudei Bavel. There's the synagogue of the Bavlim. If you've been to Jerusalem, there's a beautiful synagogue in Nachlaot called the Ades Synagogue or the Aleppo Synagogue. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's a truly beautiful synagogue. And you can go there in the month of Elul before Rosh Hashanah and see people waking up at 4 a.m. to sing the piyutim exactly the way they've been done in Syria. And so a lot of the Jewish life that existed in Babylon or in Syria was sort of recreated to the extent possible in Israel with maintaining the tradition. As I said, the Keter Aram Soba is in the Israel Museum, so we have not all of it, some of it, but not all of it. A lot of it was destroyed. And there's also speculation where those missing parts are, but Jews really recreated that life inside Israel. If anyone has any questions, comments, I'm happy to hear. I know people are always curious to know what we'll be speaking about next week, what Jewish community. So I'll say right now that the Jewish community we'll be speaking about is the Ethiopian Jewry, the Jews of Ethiopia. And maybe Steve, if you want to say something, just in terms of your recent visit, or maybe if there's anything that needs to be corrected, then by all means, let me highlight you. Is it okay if I?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I guess.
All right.
First of all, thank you so much for that. It was fascinating. I've been to both Syria and Iraq, as you know. The one thing that I do want to say, though, about Iraq, in terms of the Jews in the 20th century, is Baghdad was something like a quarter or a third Jewish in the 1920s. And proportionally, there were more Jews in Baghdad than any other group. In other words, Shia, Sunni, Zoroastrians, et cetera. That was in the 1920s. From what I've read, from what I've heard, and from historians that I've gleaned, is that the Farhud, it was an awful event. It really was in 1941. Yet it was almost a little blip in the system, because you had many Muslim and Christian neighbors protecting Jewish families. And I've spoken to people who said how they were protected by their Muslim neighbors. Okay. So that's one thing. And then after the Farhud happened, actually from 1941 until 1948, the Jewish community in Iraq and Baghdad actually had it very good. And they actually prospered during that time. It wasn't until 1948 that things started to get a little bit tricky. The point about Zionism also, historians will also say and point out that the Jews of Baghdad, the Jews of Iraq in general, but let's just say Baghdad because that's where they were concentrated, they consider themselves really Arab Jews. Their Arabness, their Iraqiness was so important and so pervasive that they looked at themselves as Arabs. And I think that has to be underscored because, as in the context of Zionism, many historians will say that many Jews in Baghdad were actually against the establishment of the state of Israel. Rabbis were, secular people were, because they looked at themselves as Arabs and they thought, well, why can't there be the same kind of country in Palestine then as there is in Iraq? So I think that that's a point that needs to be made. Once 1948 happened, that's where sorry to say, the fertilizer hit the fan. And that's where things got really difficult. And let's fast forward then to, I believe it was 1969, when it got even worse after the Six-Day War for Jews in Iraq. Jews were hung with several others in Tahrir Square, Freedom Square, in the center of Baghdad, and things got really bad. But there were Jews through the 1970s and the 1980s. When I was there in November, and I met with someone who takes people around rather clandestinely to Jewish areas. He showed me, he told me about the Jews that are living in Iraq now, that are living in Baghdad, but they're living very under the radar, okay? And on their ID forms, they'll say that they're Christian. And he showed me actually several graves of Jews that passed away in the 2020 and in the early 2000s. So there were always Jews there. So I just wanted to underscore that. And as it relates to Damascus, I was actually at that synagogue in Damascus where Elisha was anointed by Eliyahu Hanavi. And there were several Jews that were still living in Damascus at that time. This was in 2008. I don't know what's happened to them since. But it was a brother and a sister, Rebecca, and I forgot his name, but they were keeping the two synagogues going, and they still had services on Shabbat. There was a police guy outside the alley that entered into the synagogue. You had to show your passport. It was a little bit of a symbiotic relationship because on the one hand, yes, they're spying on you, but on the other hand, they're also protecting you. And according to the Jews, the handful that were still in Damascus, they said, yes, their neighbors, their barbers, their people in their community knew that they were Jewish and they were just left alone. So,
wow.
So just
all right. So Bezrat Hashem, we should merit to visit there in a peaceful way. That things should be better for the Jewish people there. It's a place with so much history. So Bezrat Hashem, we should be blessed to visit there openly as Jews and really with safety. Bezrat Hashem.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to everyone who's been here, and thank you for bearing with me. And Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll be back, same time, same place. If you're in the synagogue, also in the synagogue, and we'll be speaking about Ethiopian Jewry. Thank you so much, everyone. Wishing everyone a good evening. Thank you.
And feel better, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.